They say there are many ways to die, some quick and merciful, others slow and cruel. But the worst death isn't physical. It's being erased while you're still breathing. My name is Margaret Miller, and my own children buried me alive. They declared me incompetent, drugged my tea, and left me in a foreign nursing home to be forgotten. They took my home, my money, my dignity, everything except my will to fight back. What they never expected was that I would find allies in the most unlikely places, or that I would devise a plan so audacious it would bring them running back to Guatemala, not out of love, but greed. When they received the call that I had died and left an inheritance, they couldn't book their flights fast enough. Little did they know, I was very much alive and waiting at the airport with a surprise that would make them wish they were the ones 6 feet under. Follow our channel for more incredible true stories. Like and comment to let us know where you're watching from. And remember, family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who sees you when everyone else looks away. My name is Margaret, and I'm alive. But for years, I was treated as if I were dead. My children said it was better this way. "It's best for you, Mom," they would say. Only no one told my heart it would be buried before its time. The last thing I remember before the absolute silence was the muffled sound of a suitcase being hastily closed and the taste of crushed pills in my tea. I woke up in a narrow room smelling of mold and wearing clothes that weren't mine. A Hispanic woman was feeding me soup and calling me Abuela Bonita. I discovered days later that I was in Guatemala and that my children, oh my children, had declared me incompetent in the United States. My own son, Michael, signed the documents. It was all done while I slept, after a small household accident. They claimed early onset Alzheimer's. Me? I've always been lucid, but being elderly means being easily disposable. And I was. On the wall of the room there was a cracked mirror, and every morning I would look at it trying to remember who I was before that exile. It was on one of those mornings that I saw the gardener for the first time, a skinny young man always wearing a cap, who left flowers hidden on the garden benches. I didn't know it yet, but he would be the only person who would really see me alive. You know, I used to have a beautiful home in Connecticut, a 3-bedroom colonial with hydrangeas that bloomed like blue clouds every summer. Michael and Linda grew up there, jumping in leaf piles and sledding down our backyard hill when winter came. I still remember the smell of apple pies cooling on the windowsill, while their father, my Robert, would call them in for dinner. Those memories feel like they belong to someone else now. The day everything changed started so ordinarily. I was watering my indoor plants, little potted friends I'd named after my favorite movie stars. I reached for the small watering can on the top shelf and felt myself getting dizzy. Just a moment of vertigo. Nothing unusual for a woman of 73, but I fell, hit my temple on the corner of the coffee table. Nothing serious, just a small cut and a bruise. Linda found me when she came by for our weekly lunch. She overreacted completely, calling Michael, who called an ambulance. I kept telling them I was fine, just a little shaken. But the look that passed between them, that silent, conspiratorial glance, still haunts me. They'd been waiting for something like this. That night, Linda made me tea. "To help you sleep, Mom," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It tasted bitter, but I drank it to please her. I remember feeling so drowsy, trying to focus on the TV show we were watching. Something about house renovations. The last thing I recall was Michael arriving, whispering with Linda in the hallway, and the sound of that suitcase being zipped shut. 3 days later, or maybe it was 4, I'm still not sure, I woke up in that strange room. The air felt different, thicker somehow, hotter. My mouth was dry, and my thoughts were cloudy like I was swimming through cotton. A small fan turned lazily overhead, pushing the humid air around rather than cooling it. The sheets were rough against my skin, nothing like my Egyptian cotton ones at home. "Buenos dias, abuela," said the woman who entered, carrying a tray with a bowl of something that smelled like chicken and corn. Her name tag read Elena. When I asked where I was, she simply patted my hand and said something about adjusting and new home. When I asked for a phone to call my children, she just smiled sadly. It took me 3 days of begging different staff members before one of them finally told me the truth. I was in a care facility called Casa de Paz outside Guatemala City. My son had arranged everything, paid for 5 years up front, left instructions that I was confused and prone to making up stories. The staff had been told to humor me, but not to believe anything I said about being brought here against my will. I spent the first month crying every night into a pillow that smelled of industrial detergent. I wrote letters that were never sent. I begged the administrator, a thin man with cold eyes named Mr. Vargas, to let me make just one phone call to the American embassy. He would smile and say, "Tomorrow, perhaps, when you're feeling more yourself." But in that cracked mirror, as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, I began to see something changing in my eyes. The despair was slowly being replaced by something harder, something colder, something that whispered, "They think you're already dead, Margaret. So what do you have to lose?" And then I saw him, the gardener, quietly placing a small wildflower on the bench where I sat each morning. Our eyes met, and he quickly looked away. But the next day, he was there again, and this time, he didn't look away. I didn't know then that this skinny boy with dirt under his fingernails would become my salvation. I didn't know that sometimes, when you're buried alive, the only way out is to claw through the soil with bloody fingers and reinvent yourself on the other side. This is my story, the story of how I died in the eyes of those who should have loved me most, and how I came back to life, one wildflower at a time. His name was Elias, shy, with gentle eyes that reminded me of autumn leaves floating on still water. He couldn't have been more than 19, with thin wrists and shoulders that carried the weight of stories I couldn't yet imagine. An orphan, I would later learn, who worked at the nursing home for food and shelter, sleeping in a small shed behind the kitchen gardens where the administration wouldn't notice an extra mouth to feed. I noticed how he would leave flowers, not the cultivated kind from the facility's manicured gardens, but wild ones that grew beyond the property fence, rebellious little blooms that didn't belong but somehow found their way in, just like him, just like me. For weeks, our only interaction was a shy nod, a brief glance. I would find his offerings on my bench each morning, sometimes a purple wildflower, other times a sprig of jasmine that would perfume my dreary room for days. I began to save them, pressing them between the pages of a tattered Bible someone had left in the common room, little pieces of beauty in a colorless existence. On the 93rd day of my exile, yes, I counted every single one, something changed. I was sitting on my usual bench, watching clouds drift across the Guatemalan sky, when he approached. Not just a quick placement of a flower before scurrying away, but an actual approach. In his hands was a flower I hadn't seen before, white with a yellow center, delicate as tissue paper. "This one is called Flor de Itzote," he said in accented English that surprised me. "It is our national flower." I accepted it with trembling fingers, our skin brushing for just a moment. Human contact, something I'd been starved of for months. The nurses here touched me clinically, adjusting pillows or taking my blood pressure. But this was different. This was a gift. "You don't look sick, Senora," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. Something broke inside me then, a dam that had been holding back months of words, months of identity. "I'm not," I whispered, my voice raspy from disuse. "My name is Margaret Miller. I'm from Connecticut. I had a garden there too, hydrangeas and peonies. I taught English literature for 37 years. I have 2 children and a grandson I've never met." The words tumbled out like water from a broken faucet. Elias listened, really listened, not with the patronizing half-smile the staff wore when I tried to explain who I really was, but with complete attention. When I finally ran out of breath, he simply nodded and said, "I believe you, Senora Margaret." 4 simple words that saved my life. In the days that followed, we established a careful routine. He would tend to the section of garden near my bench, and I would speak softly of my life before. I told him about the blue dress I had bought for my daughter Linda's wedding, a wedding I was never invited to. about the birthday cards I'd sent to my grandson every year, never knowing if he received them, about Robert, my husband, who had died 5 years earlier from heart failure, leaving me alone with children who saw me as a burden rather than a mother. In exchange, Elias taught me Spanish words, whispering them like secrets between us as he pruned roses or pulled weeds. Libertad, he would say. Freedom. Esperanza. Hope. Paciencia. Patience. Sometimes, when no one was looking, we would share a quiet laugh over the administrator's pompous walks through the garden. His nose always pointed skyward, as if the very air around him was beneath his dignity. Elias had his own stories too. Abandoned at a church doorstep as an infant, raised in a state orphanage where kindness was as rare as winter snow in Guatemala, a natural talent for coaxing life from soil that had kept him employed, if not quite respected. Dreams of someday having enough money to attend university and study botany. Plants never lie, he told me once. They never pretend to be something they're not. They either grow or they don't. It was on a particularly rainy afternoon when Elias slipped me a small notebook and pencil. "Would you like to write a letter?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously to check if anyone was watching. "To whom?" I asked, the weight of the pencil strange in my hand after so long. His answer was simple but profound. "To someone who still remembers who you are." I laughed bitterly. "I don't think such a person exists anymore." "Then write to yourself," he suggested, "so you don't forget." That night, under the dim light of my bedside lamp, I wrote. Not just a letter, but a testimony. I documented everything: the accident at home, the drugged tea, waking up in Guatemala, the legal papers my son had apparently signed declaring me incompetent. I wrote about the facility, about Mr. Vargas who would sometimes watch me from his office window with cold calculation. I wrote about Elias and his flowers. I tucked the pages carefully inside the old Bible under my mattress, alongside the pressed flowers, a record of my existence, proof that I was still here. The next morning, the Bible was gone. My heart raced with panic. Had the staff found it? Would they punish Elias for helping me? Would they move me somewhere even more isolated? I waited anxiously on my bench, but Elias didn't come to the garden that day, nor the next. By the third day of his absence, I felt the familiar darkness of despair creeping back in. Perhaps this too had been taken from me. On the fourth day, just as I was about to return to my room from the garden, resigned to another loss, I felt something small and hard pressed into my palm as a figure passed by. It was Elias, his face unreadable as he continued walking as if he hadn't stopped. In my hand was a small wooden cross, barely larger than a matchbook, and carved into its surface was a single word: paciencia. I thought it was carelessness at first. The Bible disappearing could have been a simple mistake. Perhaps a well-meaning nurse had taken it to the chapel or placed it in the common room. But when I asked Elena about it the next morning, she avoided my eyes and mumbled something about cleaning procedures before hurrying away. That wasn't the reaction of someone who had innocently misplaced something. Elias returned to the gardens 3 days after giving me the wooden cross, but he was different. His usual gentle smile seemed forced, his movements stiff as he pruned the roses near my bench. When I tried to catch his eye, he gave me an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning. Someone was watching. I pretended to doze in the sun, my eyes nearly closed but alert enough to notice Mr. Vargas standing at his office window, his thin silhouette framed by the curtains as he observed us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What had happened during Elias's absence? Had they threatened him? Punished him? Later that week, when Elena was helping me back to my room after dinner, I heard whispered voices coming from behind Mr. Vargas's closed door. One was his, sharp and irritated. The other was female, speaking rapid Spanish. I caught only fragments. Payments continue, and no complications. Who was paying for my imprisonment here? Michael, of course. My own son, who had declared me incompetent. But who was he speaking with? Who was checking up on their investment in my disappearance? That night I couldn't sleep. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in on me. Outside my window, the moon cast silver light across the garden, illuminating the bench where Elias and I would sit. I watched as a figure crossed the grounds. Elias, moving with purpose towards the maintenance shed. He emerged moments later with something in his hand, glancing nervously over his shoulder before disappearing beyond the property fence. The next morning, he was there in the garden as usual. When he bent to pull a weed near my bench, he whispered, "I have a friend in town. He might help us send another letter." His voice was barely audible, his lips barely moving. "Be ready tomorrow." Hope fluttered in my chest like a caged bird, but so did fear. If they had taken my first letter, they were already suspicious. What would happen if they caught us trying again? That afternoon, I noticed one of the caregivers, a young woman named Luce, going through my drawers when she thought I was napping. Her slender fingers rifled through my meager possessions, the nightgown the facility had given me, a hairbrush, a small notepad with doodles I'd made to pass the time. Her movements were practiced, efficient. This wasn't the first time she'd searched my things. I remembered the man in the suit who occasionally visited Mr. Vargas, always on the last Friday of the month, always staying for exactly 30 minutes. I had assumed he was from the government or perhaps the facility's corporate office. But now I wondered, was he checking up on me specifically? Reporting back to my children that their mother was still safely tucked away, forgotten in a foreign country? The thought made my blood boil. All those years I had loved them, sacrificed for them. The college tuitions I'd paid even after Robert died. The nights I'd stayed up helping Linda with her law school applications. The down payment I'd given Michael for his first house. And this was how they repaid me, by erasing me from existence. The next day, Elias and I executed our plan with military precision. He brought me a gardening glove and asked loudly if I would help him plant some marigolds. "For the Day of the Dead celebration, Senora." The staff didn't bat an eye. What harm could an old woman do playing in the dirt? As we knelt in the soft earth, he slipped me an envelope and a pen. "Write quickly," he murmured, positioning his body to shield me from the main building's windows. "My friend Samuel Reyes is a lawyer. He helps people like you." My hands trembled as I scrawled my story on the paper. My full name, Margaret Eleanor Miller. My home address in Connecticut. My children's names and contact information. The date I'd been brought here. The legal documents I believed had been falsified. I folded the letter, adding the only photograph I had of myself, a small ID picture Eleanor had taken when I first arrived, for their records. My face looked shocked in it, my eyes wide with disbelief at what was happening to me. Elias took the letter and tucked it inside his shirt. "I will take it to him tonight. He works at a legal aid office in the city." "What if they're watching you too?" I whispered, suddenly afraid for him. His young face hardened with determination. "They watch everyone, but I'm not afraid of them." That night I prayed for the first time in years, not to any specific God, but to whatever forces might exist in the universe that cared about justice. "Please let the letter reach someone who can help me. Please don't let Elias be caught." The next morning he didn't come to the garden, nor the day after. My heart sank with each passing hour. Had they discovered him? Fired him? Worse! On the third day, just as despair was setting in, he appeared, limping slightly with a darkening bruise near his left eye that he tried to hide by pulling his cap lower. "What happened?" I gasped when he finally approached my bench. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice tight. "The letter is safe. Samuel has it." Did they hurt you?" The guilt was crushing. I had dragged this boy into my nightmare. Elias gave me a small, brave smile. "A few men from the village. They said orphans shouldn't meddle in the affairs of rich Americans." He shrugged as if it were nothing. "But Samuel is not afraid. He has handled cases like this before." "Like this?" I echoed. "You mean I'm not the only one?" His eyes met mine, serious beyond his years. "There are many forgotten people in places like this, Senora Margaret. The rich of your country. They think Guatemala is a place to hide their problems." The realization hit me like a physical blow. How many others were there like me? Elderly parents inconveniently tucked away where no one would think to look for them. A week passed with agonizing slowness. Then too, No word from Samuel. Elias assured me he was working on my case, but needed time to gather evidence, to make connections. And then, unexpectedly, my phone rang. The ancient landline in the common room that almost never received calls. Elena brought it to me, her face puzzled. "It's your daughter," she said. "From America." My heart thundered in my chest as I took the receiver with trembling hands. Linda's voice crackled across the line, thousands of miles away, yet suddenly, painfully close. "Mom?" she said, her voice choked with what sounded like tears. "It's been so long. I just needed to hear your voice." I couldn't speak for a moment. All the words I'd rehearsed in my head for this moment vanished. "Linda," I finally managed. "Are you calling to bring me home?" There was a pause, a heavy silence. "We only wanted what was best for you, Mom. But everything's so expensive now. Michael lost his job and the house." The line went dead before I could respond. Cut off. Whether by distance or by design, I'll never know. That night I realized the truth. There would be no easy rescue, no tearful reunion. The daughter I had raised had called not to save me, but to ease her own conscience. To my own children, I was not a person to be loved, but a problem to be managed. As I sat in the garden watching the sun set over a land that was not my home, Elias brought me flowers as usual, but his face was grim. "Samuel has been arrested," he whispered, kneeling beside me under the pretense of showing me a damaged leaf. "They charged him with forging documents." My last hope, extinguished like a candle in the wind. "The administrator knows," Elias continued, his voice barely audible. "He smiled when I mentioned Samuel's name, said you should accept your place here, that the world has forgotten you." Something died inside me that evening, the naive belief that justice would prevail, that my children would come to their senses, that the system would correct this obvious wrong. But something else was born in its place, a cold, hard determination. "How long would it take," I asked Elias, "to get me out of here legally, to fight this?" His young face was solemn as he answered. "Years. Years I might not have at my age. Years of being Margaret who is not Margaret, the American senora who talks to herself in the garden. Years of wondering if my grandson was growing up without even knowing I existed." "Then we need a different plan," I said, feeling a strange calm settle over me, something they won't expect. That week, one of the elderly residents died of pneumonia. I watched from my window as they carried her body out in a plastic bag. No family present to mourn her. No funeral, no ceremony, just another forgotten person, disappearing for the second time. It could have been me. It would be me, eventually, unless I did something drastic. "I need to die, Elias," I whispered to him the next day. "Before I really do." His eyes widened, but he was clever enough to understand immediately. "A ghost can go where a prisoner cannot," he murmured, nodding slowly. And so our real plan began to take shape, there among the roses and marigolds, under the watchful eyes of those who thought they had buried me already. Death is a peculiar thing to plan, especially your own. In movies, fake deaths involve dramatic car explosions or bodies washing up on shores. But here, in this forgotten corner of Guatemala, with limited resources and constant surveillance, my options were considerably more modest, and yet somehow more terrifying for their simplicity. Elias and I began our meticulous planning during our gardening sessions, whispering between the roses and marigolds. The boy was resourceful beyond his years, his mind sharp from a lifetime of having to think his way out of difficult situations. "The records here are mostly paper," he explained one afternoon, his hands busy with pruning shears while his voice remained barely audible. "Mr. Vargas has a computer, but the staff works with clipboards and handwritten notes. If those papers were to disappear and new ones take their place." I understood what he was suggesting, a bureaucratic death, the kind that happens with signatures and stamps rather than with a final breath. In a place where so many were already forgotten, how hard would it be to simply erase one more name? "But we would need access to those records," I whispered back, pulling a weed with more force than necessary. "And to official letterhead, stamps, things we don't have." Elias's smile was thin but determined. I have a friend who works nights cleaning the administration office. And Samuel, before he was arrested, he left me something that might help. For the next 2 weeks, our plan took shape like a delicate origami creation, fold by precise fold. First, we needed to document who I truly was. Using a small digital camera Elias had borrowed from a cousin, we took proper photographs of me, not smiling, holding a piece of paper with the current date. Evidence for later, when we would need to prove that Margaret Miller had been very much alive while being declared dead. "Hold this newspaper," Elias instructed one morning, quickly snapping a photos before tucking the camera back into his pocket. The image would show me the date, my location, all the evidence a good lawyer would need someday. The second part was harder, creating a medical emergency convincing enough to justify my death, but not so dramatic as to require an autopsy or involve authorities who might ask questions. "Heart failure," Elias suggested. "It's common, expected for someone your age, and the facility doesn't have equipment to do complicated tests." I nodded, trying not to feel insulted by his matter-of-fact assessment of my mortality. "And then instead of your death certificate, we submit paperwork for another resident who died recently. Change the name, the dates. The administration rarely checks details once someone is gone." It was brilliant in its simplicity, though the moral implications weighed heavily on me. We would be using someone else's death, a woman named Isabella, who had passed away with no family to claim her, as a cover for my disappearance. Her body had already been cremated, her ashes sitting unclaimed in the facility's small chapel. "It feels wrong," I admitted to Elias. "Using her this way." His young face was solemn. "Isabella told me once that she prayed every night to be reunited with her children who moved to Mexico City and never returned. Perhaps in helping you find your way back to your family, she would find some peace." I wasn't convinced, but I had few alternatives. The plans continued. Through his network of friends, other invisible workers who kept the facility running while being treated as if they themselves were invisible, Elias gathered what we needed. Letterhead stolen 1 sheet at a time from the administration office. A stamp borrowed overnight from Mr. Vargas's desk and returned before it was missed. Forms that detailed the procedures following a resident's death. Most importantly, he found my file, the thick folder containing the fraudulent papers that had imprisoned me here. My supposed diagnosis, signed by a doctor I'd never met. The power of attorney documents giving Michael control over my affairs. The transfer authorization that had shipped me across borders like unwanted cargo. "They keep everything," Elias whispered, his voice tight with anger as he described the contents. "Even receipts for payments your son makes every month. $1,500. That's what your freedom costs." The amount struck me like a physical blow. Less than my monthly Social Security check. Less than what I used to spend on groceries and utilities back home. That was my value to my own child. "There's something else," Elias added, hesitation in his voice. "Monthly reports sent to your family, with photos." "Photos?" My blood ran cold. "Of me?" He nodded grimly. "Taken while you sleep, to prove you're still here, still contained." I felt violated in a way I couldn't articulate. While I'd been sitting in this garden, thinking I'd been forgotten, my children had been receiving regular updates, visual confirmation of my continued imprisonment. They knew exactly where I was, what was being done to me. This wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. The final piece of our plan came from an unexpected source. Elena, the caregiver who had been kind to me from the beginning, found me alone in the common room one evening. Without speaking, she pressed something into my hand, a small bottle of pills. "For your heart, Senora," she said loudly enough for others to hear. Then her voice dropping to a whisper. "My mother was brought here too, against her will. I found her too late." Before I could respond, she walked away, her back straight, her face carefully blank. I looked down at the bottle in my hand. The label had been removed, but I recognized the small white tablets inside. Not heart medication, but sleeping pills, strong ones. That night, I couldn't sleep, turning our plan over and over in my mind. We would stage my medical emergency the following week, during the night shift when the facility was most understaffed. Elias's friend who cleaned the offices would swap my file with Isabella's, changing just the names and dates. Elena would confirm my death and help process the paperwork before anyone could look too closely. And then in the confusion, I would simply walk out, dressed in borrowed clothes, carrying nothing that could identify me. Elias would meet me beyond the property fence with transportation to a safe house Samuel had arranged before his arrest, a small apartment in a neighboring town where I could stay while we fought to restore my legal identity. It was dangerous. If caught, Elias could lose much more than his job. Elena risked criminal charges, and I had already been buried alive once. What more could they do to me? As dawn broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across my small room, I made my final decision. I would rather die trying to reclaim my life than continue living as a ghost. That week, as I sat in the garden watching butterflies dance among the flowers, I felt strangely at peace. Whatever happened, I had found something I thought I'd lost forever when I woke up in this place. My own will, my determination, and something else, perhaps even more precious. People who saw me as a human being worth fighting for. "Are you ready?" Elias asked quietly, kneeling beside my bench to pull a weed. I looked at the facility that had been my prison, at the windows where unknown eyes might be watching us even now, at the gates that had kept me contained. Then I looked at this brave young man who had risked everything for a stranger. "Yes," I said with certainty. "It's time for Margaret Miller to die." Dying is surprisingly simple when you have nothing left to lose. That Wednesday night, as the tropical rain pounded against the windows of Casa de Paz like angry fists demanding entry, I prepared for my own death. I had taken 2 of Elena's sleeping pills earlier that evening during dinner. Not enough to harm me, just enough to make my movements sluggish, my speech slightly slurred, the perfect symptoms of a stroke or heart attack in progress. As instructed, I had eaten very little and complained quietly of a headache to anyone who would listen. At precisely 10:42 p.m., I pressed the call button beside my bed. Then I carefully knocked over the glass of water on my nightstand, creating a reason for immediate assistance. When Elena arrived, I was slumped against my pillows, my right arm limp at my side, my words deliberately garbled. "My chest hurts," I whispered, clutching at my nightgown with my left hand. "Can't feel my arm." Elena's eyes widened in perfectly feigned alarm. "Senora Margaret, stay calm. I will get help." But instead of rushing for the night supervisor, she closed my door and quickly drew the privacy curtain. From beneath her uniform, she produced a small bag containing a change of clothes, simple items that would transform me from patient to visitor. A dark blue skirt, a white blouse with subtle embroidery, sensible shoes, a colorful scarf to wrap around my head, hiding my distinctive silver hair. "Quickly," she whispered, helping me change. "Ramon will be here in 5 minutes to take you. I'll handle everything else." As I buttoned the unfamiliar blouse with trembling fingers, reality crashed over me like a wave. This was really happening. After months of captivity, I was about to walk out of this place, either to freedom or to a far worse fate if we were caught. "What about my file?" I asked. "The paperwork?" "Already done," Elena said, gathering my discarded nightgown. "Elias's friend Carlos switched everything last night. As far as Casa de Paz is concerned, Isabella Mendez died tonight of heart failure, and Margaret Miller was transferred to a facility in Mexico City last week." She gave a grim smile. "They keep such poor records. No one will notice the discrepancy for months, if ever." She helped me to my feet, steadying me as I swayed slightly from the effects of the medication. "Remember, walk with purpose but not too quickly. Keep your head down. If anyone speaks to you, just nod and keep moving. Most of the night staff don't pay attention to visitors leaving late after saying goodbye to their loved ones. And if they do notice..." Eleanor's face hardened. "Then I lose my job, and you go back to being a prisoner. Or worse." The risk she was taking hit me like a physical blow. This young woman barely knew me, yet she was risking everything, her livelihood, possibly even her freedom, to help me escape. I reached out and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Leave, she said simply. Live well. That's payment enough. A soft knock at the door signaled Ramon's arrival. Elena quickly arranged the pillows on my bed to resemble a sleeping form, then pulled the covers up. In the dim light, it would pass a cursory inspection. Go with God, Senora Margaret, she whispered, opening the door just enough for me to slip through. Ramon, a stooped older man, with kind eyes and a face lined by decades of hard work, nodded curtly and gestured for me to follow him. We moved silently through the darkened hallway, past the nurse's station where a bored attendant was engrossed in her mobile phone, and toward the rear service entrance used by the kitchen staff. Each step felt like walking on glass. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool night air. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential alarm, but no one stopped us. No one even looked twice at an elderly woman following a maintenance worker through the dimly lit corridors. I was invisible, just as I had been since arriving at this place. Only now, that invisibility was my salvation rather than my prison. The service door opened with a soft creak that nevertheless sounded like thunder to my terrified ears. And then, incredibly, I was outside. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and tropical flowers. I took a deep breath, feeling as though I was filling my lungs properly for the first time in months. This way, Ramon murmured, leading me across the dark grounds toward a gap in the property fence, hidden behind a storage shed. Elias is waiting on the other side. Sure enough, as we squeezed through the narrow opening in the fence, I saw the familiar silhouette of my young friend standing beneath a large mango tree, holding an umbrella. His face broke into a wide smile when he saw me, a smile that quickly turned to concern when I stumbled on the uneven ground. Careful, Senora Margaret, he said, catching my arm. We still have a long way to go. He led me to a battered pickup truck parked on a dirt road about 50 yards from the facility's perimeter. The vehicle looked ancient, rust creeping along its edges like a slow disease. But the engine started immediately when Elias turned the key. It's my uncle's, he explained as we bounced along the rough road, headlights cutting through the misty darkness. He thinks I'm using it to visit a girl in the next town. I stared out the window as Casa de Paz receded into the distance, hardly daring to believe I was actually leaving it behind. For so long, those walls had defined the boundaries of my world. Now they were shrinking, becoming insignificant against the vast Guatemalan night. Where are we going? I finally asked. To a place Samuel arranged before he was arrested. A small apartment above a bookstore in Antigua. The owner is his cousin. You'll be safe there while we figure out what to do next. The drive took nearly 2 hours, winding through mountains on roads that sometimes seemed more like suggestions than actual highways. We passed small villages where dogs barked at our headlights, roadside shrines decorated with wilting flowers, and valleys so deep and dark they seemed to contain the very essence of night itself. I must have dozed off despite the bumpy ride, because I woke with a start when the truck stopped moving. We were parked in a narrow cobblestone street, lined with colorful buildings. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, I could see that this was a beautiful colonial town, a far cry from the isolated facility I'd left behind. We're here, Elias said softly. Can you walk a little further? The apartment was tiny but clean, with a small balcony overlooking a courtyard filled with potted plants, a single bed with fresh linens, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a hot plate for cooking. Simple, but after months of institutional living, it felt like a palace. The owner lives next door, Elias explained, setting down the small bag of supplies he'd brought. Her name is Lucia. She knows only that you're a friend of Samuel's who needs a quiet place to stay. She won't ask questions. Dawn was breaking over the tiled rooftops of Antigua as Elias prepared to leave. He had to return the truck before his uncle noticed it missing. Had to be back at Casa de Paz for his morning shift, as if nothing had happened. What now? I asked, suddenly afraid. The escape had been the focus of all our planning. But what came next? How would I, a woman officially dead in Guatemala and legally incompetent in the United States, reclaim my life? Elias smiled, that determined expression I'd come to recognize, lighting his young face. Now we bring Margaret Miller back to life and make those who buried her face what they've done. As he left, closing the door behind him, I stood alone in my new sanctuary. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to morning prayers. Inside, a woman who no longer officially existed contemplated resurrection. Freedom feels different than I remembered. During those first days in Antigua, I found myself standing motionless in the middle of the tiny apartment, overwhelmed by the simple ability to decide what to do next. Should I make tea, read a book, stand on the balcony and watch the world go by? After months of having every moment dictated by institutional schedules, even these small choices felt monumental. My new landlady, Lucia, was a plump, cheerful woman in her 60s who ran the bookstore below my apartment. She asked no questions about my past, though I caught her curious glances when she thought I wasn't looking. Each morning she would bring me fresh bread and coffee, chatting about the weather or local gossip as if I were any normal tenant. "The Festival of San Pedro is this weekend," she mentioned one morning, 3 weeks after my arrival. "The whole town will be celebrating. Perhaps you would like to watch from the balcony. The procession passes right below." I hesitated. I had not left the apartment since arriving, afraid of being recognized, though I couldn't say by whom. Everyone who knew Margaret Miller believed her to be in a nursing home, or dead. "I think I would like that," I said finally. "Thank you, Lucia." She beamed, patting my hand with maternal affection. "Good. It's not healthy to stay inside all the time. The sun and air, they are medicine for the soul." That weekend, dressed in clothes Lucia had lent me, a colorful blouse and long skirt typical of the region, I sat on my small balcony and watched as the town celebrated. Streets filled with music and dancing, children laughing, couples holding hands. Life in all its messy, vibrant glory paraded below me. I found myself smiling, then laughing, then crying, emotions I had suppressed for so long flooding back in overwhelming waves. It was during this festival that Elias returned, slipping quietly into the bookstore after closing time. Lucia led him up to my apartment with a knowing smile that made me wonder how much she truly understood about my situation. "You look well, Señora Margaret," he said, his young face creasing with genuine pleasure at seeing me. "Freedom suits you." But his smile faded quickly as he pulled a folded newspaper from his backpack and placed it on the table between us. It was a local paper from the region where Casa de Paz was located. "There was an investigation," he said grimly. "After you, after Isabella's body was cremated. Someone from the American embassy came asking questions." My hands trembled as I picked up the paper. The article was small, tucked away on page 6. "Unidentified American woman dies at care facility," read the headline. The brief text mentioned an investigation into record keeping at several facilities that catered to foreign nationals. "They suspect something happened," I whispered. Elias nodded. Elena was questioned. So was Mr. Vargas. "They're checking records, trying to match patients with official documentation." Cold fear gripped my chest. "Will they find out? About me? About what we did?" "Not yet. The paperwork we created shows you were transferred to Mexico City. If they check, they'll find a facility that closed 6 months ago. Records lost. A bureaucratic dead end." His smile was grim. "But we need to move faster now. It's time for the next part of our plan." Over the next 2 hours, as the festival continued outside, Elias outlined what he and Samuel had been working on. Samuel, released from jail on lack of evidence but still under surveillance, had been quietly gathering documentation, proof of what had happened to me, and shockingly, to others like me. "Casa de Paz is not the only place," Elias explained, spreading papers across the table. "There are others, all in countries with loose regulations, all catering to wealthy Americans looking to dispose of family members." The words hit me like physical blows. Dispose. As if we were trash to be discarded, rather than humans who had committed the sin of growing old and inconvenient. "But how will this help me get my life back?" I asked. struggling to focus on my own situation rather than the horrifying bigger picture. Samuel has a friend at an international human rights organization. They're building a case, and you, he pointed to me, his eyes intense, are going to be their star witness. My heart raced at the thought. But I'm legally dead, or incompetent, or both. Which is why we need to prove you're neither. He pulled out another document, a letter from a psychiatrist in Guatemala City, willing to examine me and provide an independent assessment of my mental capacity. Once we have that, we contact a specific reporter Samuel knows at the New York Times. We tell your story. We make it impossible for them to keep you hidden. The plan was audacious, risky. If it failed, I would likely be returned to Casa de Paz, or worse. But if it succeeded, when? I asked simply. Tomorrow. The doctor comes tomorrow. And then if all goes well, we record your testimony the day after. That night, after Elias left, I stood on the balcony long after the festival had wound down, watching as workers dismantled decorations and swept confetti from the cobblestone streets. My mind was racing, replaying memories from before my exile. Michael's face, as he assured me the short stay at the facility would help me recover. Linda's voice on the phone, not asking about my well-being, but lamenting her own financial troubles. The grandson I'd never met. What would they do when they discovered I was alive? That I was fighting back? Would they deny everything? Claim they'd been misled about the facility? Or would they reveal their true colors and fight to maintain the fiction of my incompetence? The psychiatrist, Dr. Fuentes, arrived promptly at 10 a.m. the next day. A dignified woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and kind eyes behind scholarly glasses. She reminded me of colleagues from my teaching days. She spent 3 hours with me, conducting standard cognitive tests, asking about my life before Guatemala, my understanding of my current situation, my plans for the future. Mrs. Miller, she said finally, setting aside her notebook, I see no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment, dementia, or any other condition that would justify a finding of incompetence. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning sound, and your emotional responses appropriate to your extraordinary circumstances. Relief washed over me like a warm wave. Having an objective professional confirm what I had always known, that I was entirely competent, felt like reclaiming a fundamental part of my identity. What happens now? I asked. I will prepare my report today. Tomorrow, I will accompany you and Mr. Menendez to meet with representatives from the Human Rights Organization. She hesitated, then added gently, what you are doing takes great courage. Many in your situation would simply accept their fate. I thought of the women at Casa de Paz, their spirits dimmed by neglect and isolation. I thought of Isabella, whose body had been used in my escape, who had died without anyone to mourn her or mark her passing. I'm not just doing this for myself, I said quietly. I'm doing it for all of us who were thrown away. When Dr. Fuentes left, I felt both exhilarated and terrified. After months of powerlessness, I was taking action, fighting back. But the battle ahead would expose me not just to legal challenges, but to the painful reality of my children's betrayal. Was I strong enough to face that? To sit across from them in a courtroom and acknowledge that the people I had raised, loved, sacrificed for, had calculated my worth and found it wanting? I had to be, because the alternative, slipping back into invisibility, accepting erasure, was no longer an option I could live with. That night, I wrote everything down, every detail I could remember about the days leading up to my exile, the drugged tea, the flight I had no memory of taking, the months at Casa de Paz. I wrote about Elias and Elena, about Samuel, about the other residents whose vacant eyes and slumped shoulders spoke of spirits crushed by abandonment. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes burned with exhaustion. Tomorrow, Margaret Miller would officially rise from the dead, and nothing would ever be the same again. The day the New York Times published my story, I felt the world shift beneath my feet. The headline was stark and unforgiving. American elder abuse scandal, wealthy families disposing of parents in foreign facilities. Beneath it, a photo of me, Not the confused, disoriented woman my children had described in their legal documents, but a clear-eyed, dignified woman sitting straight-backed in an Antigua cafe, my silver hair neatly styled, my gaze direct and unwavering. The reporter, Jessica Morales, had spent 2 days with me, recording hours of interviews, verifying my story against the documentation Samuel and Elias had gathered. Her article was devastating in its methodical detailing of what had happened, not just to me, but to at least 17 other American seniors who had been effectively disappeared by their families into a network of unregulated care facilities across Central America. These are not cases of families seeking affordable care options, Jessica wrote. The monthly fees paid to these facilities often exceed what quality nursing homes in the U.S. would charge. Rather, these appear to be cases where families sought to remove elderly relatives from sight and oversight, often to gain control of substantial assets. Within hours of publication, my story had been picked up by major networks. By evening, it was the lead story on CNN, complete with footage of Casa de Paz shot from the road, since the reporters had been denied entry. A grim-faced Mr. Vargas could be seen hurrying to his car, refusing to comment. Elena was nowhere to be seen. She had wisely taken a few days off, staying with relatives in another town. Samuel, now openly acting as my attorney, despite continuing harassment from local officials, set up a secure video call so I could see the coverage. My hands trembled as footage appeared of my Connecticut home, the colonial with the hydrangeas I had lovingly tended for decades. A reporter stood on the sidewalk, noting that neither my son Michael nor my daughter Linda had responded to requests for comment. "They will have to respond now," Samuel said, his voice firm with conviction. "This is too big to ignore. The State Department is involved. There will be investigations." He was right. Within 24 hours, Michael released a statement through his attorney, claiming he had been misled about the nature of the facility and was devastated to learn of the conditions his mother had endured. He claimed to have been told I was receiving specialized memory care in a partner facility with a U.S. nursing home chain, and that he had been shown falsified reports of my supposed cognitive decline. Linda remained silent, but her husband, a corporate lawyer whose ambitions had always outstripped his ethics, was spotted entering the offices of one of Connecticut's most prominent criminal defense attorneys. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my apartment above Lucia's bookstore, feeling strangely detached, as if observing a film about someone else's life. Samuel had insisted I remain in Guatemala for now, protected by the growing presence of international media and human rights observers who had descended on Antigua like a flock of justice-seeking birds. "Your legal status is still complicated," he explained. "Your children filed papers declaring you mentally incompetent. Those haven't been invalidated yet. If you return to the U.S. now, they could potentially have you detained for psychiatric evaluation." It was a bitter pill to swallow, being legally barred from returning to my own country, my own home, because of documents my children had signed. But Samuel was working with American attorneys to challenge those findings, armed with Dr. Fuentes' comprehensive evaluation and the growing scandal that made it difficult for any judge to ignore the dubious circumstances of my alleged incompetence. 1 week after the story broke, Elias burst into my apartment, eyes wide with excitement. "They're coming," he announced, brandishing his phone. "Your children, they've booked flights to Guatemala City, arriving tomorrow." My heart stuttered in my chest. "Coming here? Why?" Samuel received a letter from their lawyer. They claim they want to reunite with their mother and make amends for the terrible misunderstanding. His young face twisted with disgust at the transparent attempt at damage control. I sank into a chair, suddenly lightheaded. After all this time, after what they had done, I would face my children again. The thought filled me with a complex storm of emotions: anger, fear, a stubborn flicker of maternal love that refused to be extinguished despite everything. "What should I do?" I whispered. Samuel, who had followed Elias up the stairs, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "That depends on what you want, Senora Margaret. You could refuse to see them. You could meet them with the press present as witnesses. Or, he hesitated. Or, I prompted, or we could use this opportunity to secure your freedom once and for all. That evening, as the sun set over Antigua's colonial buildings and cast long shadows across my small balcony, Samuel outlined a bold plan. My children, desperate to salvage their reputations and possibly avoid criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud, would likely offer anything to get me to drop my public campaign and return quietly to the States. We don't let them off the hook, Samuel explained, his normally gentle eyes hard with determination. But we can use their desperation to secure legally binding documents, a reversal of the incompetence finding, restoration of your financial control, a public retraction of their claims. And in return? I asked, already knowing the answer. You agree not to press criminal charges. You allow them to save face by claiming they were misled by unscrupulous medical professionals. You give them a path to redemption in the public eye, if not in reality. The practical side of me recognized the wisdom in this approach. A protracted legal battle would drain my remaining resources and energy. My children, despite their actions, had connections and resources of their own. And at 73, how many years did I have left to waste in courtrooms and depositions? But another part of me, the part that had lain awake in that narrow bed at Casa de Paz, staring at the cracked ceiling and wondering how my own flesh and blood could discard me so completely, thirsted for justice, for consequences, for them to face even a fraction of the pain and isolation I had endured. I need to think, I said finally. Alone that night, I paced my small apartment, memories flooding back with each turn. Michael as a toddler, arms raised trustingly for me to lift him. Linda on her first day of school, brave smile barely hiding her nervousness. Family dinners around our oak table, Christmas mornings, graduations, moments that had formed the tapestry of a life I had believed was built on love. How had we come to this? When had I become an inconvenience rather than a mother? Was it when Robert died, leaving me alone? When I began to need occasional help with household tasks? Or had the capacity for such callousness always been there, hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly normal family life? Dawn found me still awake, watching as Antigua slowly came to life below my window. Street vendors setting up carts, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, the first tourists emerging from hotels with cameras and guidebooks. Normal life continuing while mine hung suspended between past and future, between justice and pragmatism. By the time Elias arrived to escort me to the meeting location, a private room at a hotel on the outskirts of town, selected for both security and discretion, I had made my decision. Whatever happens in there, I told Samuel as our car approached the hotel, I won't be bullied or manipulated. Not again. He nodded, solemn respect in his eyes. Today you are in control, Senora Margaret, not them. The hotel room was bland and impersonal. Beige walls, generic artwork, a conference table with chairs arranged on opposite sides like the setting for a diplomatic negotiation between hostile powers, which, in a way, it was. I took my seat with Samuel beside me, Elias standing protectively near the door, and waited for the children who had buried me alive to arrive and face what they had done. They were late. Of course they were late. It seemed oddly fitting that even for this momentous, life-altering meeting, my children couldn't manage to arrive on time. The minutes ticked by on the generic hotel clock, 5, then 15, then 30, as Samuel exchanged increasingly concerned glances with Elias. I sat motionless, hands folded in my lap, outwardly calm while my insides twisted with a volatile mixture of dread and determination. Finally, at 37 minutes past our scheduled time, the door opened. Michael entered first, my son, my firstborn, now a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a paunch that strained against his expensive button-down shirt. Behind him came Linda, slender and elegant as always, her blonde hair highlighted and styled in a way that must have cost hundreds of dollars. And trailing them both, to my surprise, was James, Linda's husband, the corporate attorney, whose ambitions had always seemed to exceed his abilities. They froze when they saw me, as if they'd been expecting someone else, perhaps the docile, confused woman they'd deposited at Casa de Paz, not the clear-eyed, composed woman who sat waiting for them. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until Samuel rose to his feet. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to the chairs across from us. "Mrs. Miller has been waiting." They moved mechanically, taking their seats with awkward, stilted movements. None of them could quite meet my eyes. Michael stared at a point just over my left shoulder. Linda examined her manicured nails, and James busied himself arranging papers from his briefcase. "Mom," Michael finally said, his voice oddly strangled, "you look, well." "Yes," I replied, my tone neutral, giving nothing away. "Prison agrees with me, apparently." Linda flinched, visibly. "Mom, it wasn't like that. We were told." "Spare me," I interrupted, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "I'm not interested in your excuses or justifications. I'm here to discuss the terms of my resurrection." James cleared his throat, assuming the professional demeanor that had always irritated me. "Mrs. Miller, I think we all want the same thing here, to resolve this unfortunate situation and bring you home where you belong." "Home?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "To which home are you referring? My house that Michael has been living in rent-free for the past year? The home whose ownership was transferred to him through documents I supposedly signed but have no memory of? That home?" Michael had the grace to look ashamed, his eyes dropping to the table. "Mom, I can explain. Or perhaps," I continued as if he hadn't spoken, "you mean the guest room in Linda's house, where I stayed for 3 weeks before being told it would be better for everyone if I had specialized care. The room that I'm told has since been converted to a home gym." Linda's cheeks flushed red. "That's not fair. We were trying to help. The doctor said—" "What doctors?" Samuel interjected sharply. "We've reviewed all medical records prior to Mrs. Miller's removal. There was no diagnosis of cognitive impairment, no recommendation for memory care, not even a suggestion of a need for assisted living." James straightened his tie, lawyer mode fully engaged now. "There were consultations that may not have been formally documented. Concerns were raised about Mrs. Miller's ability to care for herself after her fall." "My fall," I repeated, the memory still vivid. "You mean when I tripped over Linda's dog and bumped my head on the coffee table? The fall that resulted in a small cut that didn't even require stitches?" "You were confused afterward," Michael insisted. "You couldn't remember what day it was." "Because I was given tea that I now know contained crushed sedatives," I countered, watching his face carefully. The flicker in his eyes told me everything. He had known. They had all known. Samuel placed a folder on the table, sliding it toward James. "These are our terms, non-negotiable." James opened the folder, scanning the documents inside with practiced efficiency. His expression darkened as he read. "This is extensive," he said finally. "Yes," Samuel agreed. "It is." The terms were indeed comprehensive. A full reversal of the incompetency ruling, complete restoration of my financial control, return of my home, and all assets that had been transferred without my legitimate consent, a substantial care allowance to be paid monthly by my children for the next 10 years, and a public statement acknowledging that I had been wrongfully institutionalized. "This would bankrupt us," Linda protested, her voice rising. "The care allowance alone is less than what you were paying Casa de Paz to keep your mother imprisoned." Samuel finished for her, his voice cold. "Consider it a bargain." Michael leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. "Mom, please. We made a terrible mistake. We thought we were doing what was best for you. Can't we just start over? Be a family again?" I studied his face, the face I had once known better than my own, the face I had watched evolve from infant to toddler to boy to man. I searched for the son I had loved, but all I could see was the man who had signed papers declaring me incompetent, who had shipped me to another country to be forgotten, who had moved into my home before my metaphorical body was even cold. "No, Michael," I said softly. We can't be a family again. That died the day you decided I was disposable. Linda began to cry, silent tears tracking mascara down her cheeks. Mom, that's not fair. We were overwhelmed. Dad was gone. You were struggling. We have our own lives, our own families. And that justifies what you did? I asked, genuinely curious about the mental gymnastics she must be performing. Because caring for your aging mother was inconvenient. Abandoning her in another country became acceptable. We never abandoned you, Michael insisted. We paid for your care. Good care, we thought. When's my birthday, Michael? I asked suddenly. He blinked, thrown by the non sequitur. What? My birthday? When is it? April. April something, he stammered. April 12th, I supplied. And in the 13 months I was at Casa de Paz, did you ever call to wish me happy birthday? Did you ever call at all, except for that one time when Linda mentioned money problems? I turned to my daughter. Did you ever send a card, a photo of my grandson, anything to remind me that I hadn't been entirely erased from existence? The silence that followed was answer enough. Sign the papers, I said wearily. Sign them and we'll all get what we want. You'll be protected from criminal charges. Your reputation's partially salvaged. And I'll be free of you. James leaned close to Linda, whispering something in her ear. She shook her head vehemently, but he persisted. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. Before we agree to anything, James said, his lawyer voice firmly in place, we need some assurance that this ends the public campaign. No more interviews, no more articles. This stays between us. Samuel started to respond, but I raised my hand, stopping him. I have one condition of my own to add, I said, looking directly at my children for the first time. I want to know why, not your excuses or justifications. The truth. Why was I so easy to discard? The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The money, he admitted. Dad's life insurance, the house, your retirement accounts. We needed it. Linda's husband's firm was failing. Was not failing, James interjected sharply. We were experiencing temporary cash flow issues. And my business was underwater, Michael continued as if James hadn't spoken. We thought, just for a while, just until we got back on our feet. We'd bring you home then. Explain it had been a misunderstanding. The raw, ugly truth hung in the air between us. I had been reduced to a balance sheet, a collection of assets to be liquidated, an inconvenient human attached to resources they wanted. Sign the papers, I repeated, my voice hollow. Within an hour it was done. Signatures notarized, documents filed electronically with courts in Connecticut, financial arrangements initiated. My children and the man who had helped orchestrate my disappearance left without meeting my eyes again, shuffling out like criminals granted an unexpected reprieve. When the door closed behind them, I felt nothing. Not the satisfaction I had expected, not the vindication, not even the rage that had sustained me for so long. Just a vast, empty space where a family had once been. It's over, Samuel said gently. You've won. Had I? As I stood to leave that sterile hotel room, I wasn't sure what victory looked like in a situation like this. I had regained my freedom, my legal identity, my financial security, but I'd lost something that could never be replaced. The illusion that love was stronger than convenience, that blood meant something unbreakable. Elias walked me back to the car, his young face solemn with witnessed pain. What will you do now, Senora Margaret? He asked as we drove away from the hotel. Will you return to Connecticut? I watched the Guatemalan landscape roll past the window, the lush mountains, the colonial architecture of Antigua receding in the distance, the children playing in village squares as we passed. This place had been my prison, but it had also been my salvation. No, I said finally, I don't think I will. Sometimes the family we're born into isn't the family that deserves us. Margaret's journey from abandoned mother to architect of her own justice reminds us that age doesn't diminish our worth, and vulnerability doesn't erase our right to dignity. In a world that often discards what it no longer finds useful, her story stands as a testament to the power of resilience and the unexpected allies we find when we need them most. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Would you have sought revenge, reconciliation, or simply the peace of starting over? Perhaps the hardest question of all, could you forgive children who saw you not as a parent to be cherished, but as an inconvenience to be hidden away? Margaret chose to rebuild her life with those who truly saw her value, not those who shared her blood but betrayed her trust. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your power. Like and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge us to examine the true meaning of family, love, and justice. Remember to comment below where you're watching from and what part of Margaret's journey resonated most with you. Because in sharing these stories, we remind each other that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone.